Hello everyone. I am delighted to be joined by Sean Murphy, an experienced digital accessibility manager and a fellow member of the Expert Reference Group for the Human Rights and Technology Project. Today, as part of the Human Rights and Technology Leading Organisational Change, we're going to be looking at education. So we know that the Australian Government's AI Action Plan included a stream of action for Australians to have the skills and capability to benefit from and participate in an AI-driven society, and another stream to include focus to ensure Australians have foundational AI education and skills. This is also covered in some detail in the Human Rights and Commission technology paper to do with providers of tertiary and vocational education, as well as professional accreditation bodies, and hopefully a new expert body to lead the national development of these skills. So Sean, thinking of the context of this, both across society as well as for people who have experienced disability, who do you think should be educated, on what and by whom?
So I'll break it down to three areas. So the first thing is, as AI and similar and data visualization, all that sort of stuff is new technology and it's jobs of the future. Everyone, all the new kids leaving school, they should be learning a degree of that if they don't make it into a profession. Yes, so you're leaving high school. They definitely should be learning part of that as their degree, obviously depending on their degree, but most degrees, if they're going to a professional type environment, private or public sector, they should learn a degree of that information about what is AI, how it's impacting me as a student, how I can do visual design, data design, just so they have a broad understanding. The people who specifically go into it as a career, that, how many of those people are being encouraged with a disability? How many people, which disabilities I should say as well, are we looking at, if there is any programs out there that does that type of thing, are they only looking at one disability sector? In the corporate world, there's a bit of a trend where they're focused on the neurodiverse group as a way of bringing in disabled people. Now, there's pros and cons around that whole program, which is not what we're talking about here today. But what are the universities doing? What is TAFE doing? Are they got programs up there to embrace the diverse group of people in the disability sector? Are the tools, the training programs, the method of delivering courses, is that accessible? If someone who had vision impairment, who's deaf, who has mobility challenges, etc., can they have the same access and have the equivalent experience, or I would prefer to say the equal experience as their able-bodied students? Do the software they use part of that training, is it locking these people out? Because if that's the case, our disability unemployment stats are going to grow in the near future.
And we know that has an impact on all of us as well. Like, there are benefits for ensuring that we have the highest participation rates across our population in the workforce. So I really like what you're saying, because it's certainly been my theory that, when you get into organisations who are choosing or designing software that is based on human rights centred design, that is easy to do if you have the right people in the room or employed in your organisation. But you're actually taking it a step back from that to make sure those people have the right qualifications to get those jobs in that organisation.
Yes.
So, and you've talked, of course, about AI. What about, how do you combine that with an understanding of human rights, which is, I suppose, where we've started? Is that something that should be part of the same kind of course, or should they be separate and then brought together once people have a good understanding of both of them?
I think the ethics side of things and ensuring that, well, there's two parts to that question I see. There's the ethics side and there's the bias of data. And ensuring that your data sets of information, you have the right people in it. A recent research paper I scanned from IBM was that a lot of the data sets don't have disabled people as part of the data set at all. Now, there is unconscious bias already in artificial technology, and that's well documented in the paper, so from the insurance sector and so forth. and some people with disabilities might not be able to afford it in the right zone or postcode areas. So they could get wrapped up into getting higher costs or whatever it is, just because they don't have the economic benefit of being in a better location.
Yeah.
But keeping into the education sector is, the ethics. Everyone should be taught the ethics side of AI if they're going to be using it, so they understand the impact to people as a whole. Because disability shouldn't be separated here; it should be just part of the topic.
Right.
And we should be including AI as in the data set, because when people are building this type of technology, and I do see this as awareness education piece, that is the hook there, because people are not doing it now.
And, AI is obviously a concept that can be both nebulous and specific. And I think it's right to think about unconscious bias in the data sets and who's using data sets, what they'll be used for in the future. So that to me ties back in very well with understanding human rights and the different kinds of discrimination that different groups can experience. But what would be the starting point for people to understand? Like, I know you have very specific views on grouping or not different disabilities that people may experience. How do you think, what's a starting point for people looking to get education on this point?
There's a talent gap already in this space. And there's an ownership where the universities and other educational institutions are not stepping up. Accessibility should be part of the training program. It shouldn't be isolated to the software engineering sector. It should be embedded to every course, which I did highlight within our conversations in the expert reference groups. Because in today's society, we are a digital world, and there's people who are going to be making calls who might not understand how to build software or design software, because they're pulling out data from some other place and making a business call saying we need X, and not understanding the holistic approach or the human side of things, how that service that you'll put into play to sell to customers or other businesses is going to impact the disability group if we focus just on that specific group.
Yeah. I was going to ask you a question about, I guess, the different kinds of people within an organisation that might need education, like boards or the compliance professional, as well as the product managers. But maybe, did you want to just give an example of how not having that knowledge, experience, or bringing it to the design or procurement process might actually impact people who experience disability?
Yeah, if the cost of uplifting a product after the fact is 30 times.
Right.
So
if business decision then.
Yes. So if your product costs you $1 million, and let's say you found 1,000 defects, and let's say, for argument's sake, each defect costs that organisation $2,000 to fix. That's one defect, 2,000 times 30. It's very simple maths. The other side is awareness, education at the board level, is understanding that customers, because 20% of the population has a disability. There's a $13 trillion spend globally. There's probably a $40 billion spend Australia-wide. So if people who are making business decisions, and HR people, our product teams, and so on, aren't making the decisions at the beginning of developing a service or a good or a technology, etc., you're not buying into that big spend value. Forgetting about the human rights thing. And putting the human rights thing is you're not making your customers, all your customers, your focus. And that's what businesses are going. They're trying to be customer centric. Now, and it's a lot to do with education awareness and accepting that people with disabilities have equal rights to your services as everyone else. Yeah,
and I love that you can bring those two things together, because as we all know, everyone is different and people respond to different incentives. And it's great to hear that there are human rights and financial incentives from adhering to these kinds of principles. I think that makes a lot of sense. And certainly any company would be glad to have a $13 trillion turnover, you would hope.
So would I.
Yes, or any individual. So if I could just go back to, I guess, a question about how different parts of an organisation might start understanding what this means, what AI or other new type technologies mean for them. If we could take an example perhaps of the human resources manager or the talent acquisition manager, is that a good place to start outside the software?
Yeah, I would probably, what I'd be looking at is, well, let's start there. I'm a HR person. I've been given a ask to say, look, I need some people who have knowledge about disabilities and accessibility. And I'm purposely focusing on that because you need people to have subject matter experts inside your organization. Now, the other side of the coin, you've got, I want to include, be more diverse in the people. Now, let's say the education system is really good and it is supporting people with disabilities to get the same equal access to education as everyone else, which is not quite the case from my point of view. Let's say that all that is there. So how does the HR find these people? So one of the problems we have, the normal mainstream headhunters don't or haven't engaged or support the disability community. A human right or recruitment part of that arm of the organisation has to go and find a specialist, people who specialise in that area. And those organisations have to have the pool of people that they can pull in. Now, and that is the current trend, and I think it's a wrong trend. I think that the mainstream employment agencies out there should be inclusive themselves, and they should be actively finding people who have disabilities and say, yes, we want to help you to get a job. Now, where the current specialists, they can help the headhunters to develop programs for those specific disabilities who need the programs to help the onboarding, and they could completely change their model in that sort of sense. The other side, we have a massive talent lack of people with accessibility skills. So people who can go in and create accessible make sure we're making accessible documentation, software, hardware, and those sort of areas, and making sure we're compliant when you're procuring products, and making sure they understand, the information they're getting from vendors. Are that information correct? Are we getting the right information, or do we have to test it to validate the information? Because and that's a big problem. Now, when we go and look for people, it can take us 3 to 6 months to find the right person because the pool it's not a very big pool.
Right.
And the other thing is, when you start getting those specialists into your team, what can happen, and the team and the company as a whole buys into the procurement thing, you can start seeing a trend of making sure technology can be used by all. And that's what I call true accessibility. Everyone can use the product the way they want to use it. But that's the big gap. It's having people having the right education and the right attitude to start making that big trend in the way that we buy products and build products.
And that's why you're sort of focused on what that means first of all at a high school level, but then at a tertiary level with the universities and TAFEs to make sure that pool is as wide as possible. Correct. Which will then benefit the organisation because they'll have the best products that meet the widest possible needs of everyone in the organisation.
Yeah, and you also have to have training programs inside your organisation to educate the people who build the software or build the services or who build the processes and things of that nature, so that they have the right level of training. But I don't ever expect them to become a deep dive specialist, because it is a specialized job. Yep. You still need the specialist to help support the teams by providing a service to ensure you are working in the right direction, because you're a developer, you can't learn everything. Yep. Or you're a designer, or you're whatever you are. You can't know everything, but you need to be able to tap onto someone to get that extra knowledge, It's like anything. If you're a HR person, you're specialised in that. You're a policy person, you specialise in that. And it's just another part of the organisation that you can get that expertise or a centre of excellence.
Oh, I love a centre of excellence. Where do you think is the right place to get that kind of education? Is it, you've talked about the role of specialists inside an organisation, or in fact, assisting with talent acquisition, but is it that we need a special body to combine all the different kinds of knowledge we're talking about today, like business acumen as well as human rights, as well as disability and accessibility? Should it be one body? Should it be many? Are there existing organisations who do it well?
I think you need some certifications required.
Yep.
Now, there are certifications that focus on accessibility. I think it's too much of a narrow scope, because you've got ethics, you've got policies, you've got regulations, all that sort of stuff. That's important to know. How deep you need to know, it's a different story. Again, I think the universities could have specific subjects that are geared towards the bigger picture of accessibility. But if they build into the course, it'll become second nature, hopefully, where they don't think about it. That's really that's the ultimate goal, is you're doing it and you're not thinking about it. Until we get there, we're just going to have internal courses or training courses at university, or programs that can build the person's knowledge broadly to get them to that level of knowledge of accessibility. Because when I look at, there's two types of specialists out there. You've got the technical person, and then you've got the policy person who's looking at a higher level, the strategic side level, and they are different skills. Because the person that's at the technical level will be coming from, how can I do this? Where the other and the way to do it, where the person at the policy is, how are we going to get to that point? And working this, I haven't really explained that properly, but they're working on more the strategic side of things, and how can we make it part of the DNA of the organisation.
Okay, so I'm trying to think again how to extend that. So the technical person is the how, and the policy, maybe it's how.
The other way around.
It's the other way around.
Yeah, so the technical person is the doer.
Okay.
And they have the knowledge of they get deeper in the impact, and they understand the impact because they see it all the time, because it's part of their job. Where the person who's on the policy side, the strategic side, is the how. How do we make this part of the DNA? That's probably a better way to explain it.
Okay. And do you think there is special knowledge required if you're, for example, a board member? I mean, a lot of people talk about, tone from the top, and we've seen an expansion of the concept of directors' duties over the last couple of years to be beyond the financial measurements that an organisation would have to adhere to. Do you think there's something special for board members that they should be across?
I think that from a board level, they have to come from the human factor. Not necessarily, the numbers factors helps a lot, but I really think they need to understand it from a human factor. And I don't think, I query how many people at board level think about the human impact or the human ethics when they make certain decisions.
Well, and then I was talking to one director about also, and I think this is something you might want to expand on. You do want a diverse board, as you do want a diverse organisation, but it may not be possible to have every possible scenario catered for at the board level. What do you think, if you had to advise someone on board composition, are there particular aspects that you would look to make sure that they did consider the human factor in making decisions?
I would say, yes, you must have inclusive. Yep. Yes, you should have a representative from each demographics, because a person with a disability or person who is from a different culture or have a certain sexual preference, they go across all boundaries. So the person,
yeah,
yes. But having someone who's living that specific demographic helps in making those decisions. And or you have a advisory group that could be a virtual team or could be a dedicated team that is made of a mixture of type of people that feeds directly into the board on their decisions. Having both would be ideal.
Great. That's a really helpful, and that's exactly what I'm looking for, is like practical tips on taking the recommendations in the paper forward, which of course is not in itself the goal, but to actually have a more inclusive society, as well as a properly functioning one financially as well. So I think we're touching on both those. There are certain recommendations in the paper specific to government organisations, particularly in the area of procurement, and you've talked a little bit about that today.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you wanted to, I guess, highlight in what a procurement professional might need to be across, or tools that they might use to ensure that they are going beyond, I guess, a tick box approach to inclusion and diversity?
So I'm going to use the USA as the model. What the USA, they have a dedicated department for their Section 508 rehab regulation. I think, remember, it's called the Access Board. And there might be another group out there as well. But they set up the training and all this sort of stuff. But they actually have people, specialized testers, they will test vendor products that they want to bring into the USA federal government or other areas, and validate, is the certification documentation provided by the vendors for accessibility, which is called the VPAT, or Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, is it true? Is it meeting up to what they're saying? And then they would feed that back. So it's part of their process to test, because you can read a piece of paper and they can give you a nice glowing report saying, we're all passing. And when you actually roll it out, you might suddenly get a client who has a accessibility need and say, I can't use my keyboard because the whole product doesn't work, or there's problems in the product. And doing that level due diligence could, as part of the procurement process, will shortcut that conversation, or help with the conversation, not shortcut the conversation, it'll shortcut the process of making sure you're getting the right product, but also help with the communication, because you can go back to the vendor. We have a very proactive, inclusive, diverse program here where we will not buy your product unless it's accessible, or you can demonstrate you have a very hard, clear roadmap on where you're going with your accessibility and when you're going to fix these problems that we found. If you do it afterwards and it's not part of your procurement agreement and contract, then that conversation is so much harder.
So it is actually a continuous or continual improvement model as well, if it's agreed up front, or is it just fixing? Oh, great, because that's certainly highlighted here.
No, the model is always, so part of the contract is whenever you bring out a new version, you prove the evidence, you provide the evidence base. If the company has the funds or willing to do it, not necessarily the funds are willing to do, they do especially on the government level, this is what they should be doing, is they validate it, and then and over time you build some level of confidence, and then you can do more random tests. But until you get to the level of confidence of what that vendor's doing, then you have a proper engagement life cycle of that, and it should be part of their life cycle. Or you can take the alternative approach and say, it's in our contract, we believe your documentation, you've breached the contract, how are you going to fix it? If you don't fix it in this time frame, this is what the penalty is going to kick in. So that's the alternative method as well. I don't think that's proactive. I think that's more the stick and the carrot. I think it's better that you make a strong relationship with the vendor, and yes, it has to be in contract, but you work together to get to that left, as we say in accessibility world, to make sure the product's accessible, because that means your organization's benefiting, they're benefiting from that collaboration, and overall, the people who require more accessible technology benefits, and the snowball starts.
A very positive snowball, I have to say.
Yes.
So I think we've covered a lot of why it's important to have this kind of education from a very early level, and how it can affect and impact different parts of an organisation, including government. Is there anything, I suppose, as a final point you wanted people to think about if they were listening to this podcast and thinking they could change something in terms of education for their organisation, or when they're designing a course as an academic?
Start thinking about accessibility, start learning about accessibility at the high level, and start, two points. If you don't have part of your procurement process of including accessibility as part of your policies. Start building that into it, and enforce it. Because if companies and business enforce it onto the vendors will listen, and they'll start making a change. Secondly, if you don't have an inclusive program where you're employing all disabilities, then relook at that program, because disability isn't one group. We are very diverse, and even with each of the demographic groups within the disability sector, we're just as diverse again. We are people. Every person's unique. So that's really the key message I would like to give to people. Everyone's unique, and you just can't box it. You just have to have a fairly diverse program and be willing to make those changes and those hard calls with businesses. If you have a product that's not accessible and you have people in your organization with disabilities and they can't use the product, then you have to make that hard call to prove the point, and someone has to do this. Say, hey, big vendor A, we're dropping your product until you make it accessible. And no one out there is willing to do it, I don't think.
To now. But hopefully, yes, when people are thinking about this aspect, they will think about some of the things that you've spoken about today. And I mean, it has to stand out to me, that $13 trillion. If you're thinking about that it's a tough commercial decision, maybe it's really not. Maybe it is actually an easier decision than you think it is. So hopefully that's something that people will take away as well.
Yes, it's like when Microsoft got a new CEO who had son have a disability, their whole focus changed.
Yeah. Well, I hope it is something we can do without having to have a personal connection, because as you say, every person is unique, so we can't be connected to everyone, despite what LinkedIn tells us sometimes. So I hope this is a few practical tips that people can take away. So thank you so much, Sean.
Not a problem.